I will start with a formal introduction and bio. So Dr. Laughlin, who we're here to enjoy the works of tonight, is a graduate of the Annenberg School of Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. Editorial note, highly prestigious program in our field. And her work focuses on digital culture, especially the interplay between religion and the digital and on digital feminism. She is the author of Redeem All, which is, as possibly already noted, an award-winning book. I mean, award-winning by saying it's the top book for 2022 by the Religious Communication Association. So again, highly prestigious, right? You do see a theme here. In addition to this amazing, in addition to this, I'm going to mess everything up. Okay. So in addition to this, her work has also been published in multiple journals, and she does public scholarship with The Atlantic and also Vice. And this is really important for the mission of our department, and so we're really, really thrilled to feature that along with her technical academic work. So she has done ethnographic and documentary filmmaking and audio projects, and has debuted at various festivals and conferences. Here at LMU, she teaches all things sexy about the media, and our students actually really benefit from and love her courses. So the formal and slightly crazy out of the way, I want to add a personal note. So as a department chair in her home department, and now as the associate dean in her college, I have to say that Dr. Laughlin is not just a prestigious scholar, but she is also an excellent teacher and an amazing colleague. So you are present tonight with greatness. And I hope that you will all celebrate her, enjoy her talk, and then stick around at the end to shake her hand, because it doesn't get any better.
Okay, thank you so much, Michelle. That's a really hard introduction to live up to, but I really appreciate it. And thank you for everyone for being here. I know it's the end of the semester and everybody's busy. And thank you also to everybody at the library who put this event on, and especially to Rhonda, who has done so much work and helped me figure this whole talk out. So I really appreciate everybody that put this together. I'm here to talk about my book, Redeem All, How Digital Life is Changing Evangelical Culture, which came out almost a year ago from the University of California Press. So first, the big question, who are evangelicals, and also why? Why evangelicals? Why even talk about them in relation to digital media? Evangelicals are typically conservative Protestant Christians, and scholars working at the intersection of media studies and religious studies have noticed that historically American evangelicals have been early adopters of new media technologies. With some scholars actually asserting that evangelicals invented mass media in the United States through their tract societies in the 19th century. And pictured here is Billy Graham, who some of you might be familiar with, who might be recognizable. Billy Graham is known as the Pope of evangelicalism. He's not actually the Pope, it's a Protestant tradition, but he was that influential in shaping what evangelical culture became and what it is today. He started a movie house, Worldwide Pictures. He had a radio show, The Hour of Decision, and he started a magazine. So in all these ways, he kind of promoted the idea that media use and being what evangelicals often say, being in but not of the world, was incredibly important to evangelicalism and how evangelicalism presented itself in American culture. Being in but not of the world, meaning using all the tools of popular culture and of media to spread messages without being tainted by those tools or without being worldly. So my initial research question was, what are evangelicals who have been historically early adopters doing in the digital age? Excuse me. And when I first started looking at this way back in 2011 and I first started talking to people, I noticed there's all these evangelicals who are starting online churches. That's really interesting. I started reaching out to them and talking to them. And what I started to find was that they were saying a lot of similar things, right? Everybody that I talked to was saying a lot of similar things, had a lot of similar ideas about how to use technology, how to, as they would put it, steward technology, and what technology could do. And I began to think of this in relation to Pierre Bourdieu's notion of habitus. And habitus is all the sort of micro, small ways that we make culture, the sort of tiny building blocks of culture. From the way we hold our fork, what we choose to eat, whether we drive through a McDonald's or order in sushi, right? All of these ways that we kind of create and reinforce culture to those around us, right? And Bourdieu often thought of this in terms of class, right? How we create and reproduce class structures through all of our behaviors, right? And also our beliefs about those behaviors. And I started to think about this in relation to technology, right? And I don't know if you have heard this idea that Apple products are particularly intuitive, right? People often say this, Apple products are particularly intuitive, right? As though it's a natural law, right? And so if you're someone who doesn't really use Apple products or doesn't like them or is confused by them, you might feel, well, there must be something wrong with me, right? Our notions about technology, where we post, how we post, all the little micro quotidian things we do with technology and how we feel about it are what I term digital habitus. And there was a specific type of digital habitus that I saw being sort of promoted in and through evangelical technological use. So this concept also really helped me as a methodological tool. I started to see myself following this discourse, following this habitus throughout evangelical culture. And what kind of happened was a decade-long travel log, or travel through evangelical culture that took me all over the place. That took me to big tech companies in Silicon Valley where I met evangelicals creating apps. That took me to giant mega churches in Dallas. That took me to a faith-based startup here in Los Angeles where I was an intern and kind of learned about that field. And it took me to churches all over the country and to conferences where people were talking about this. And it ended up being actually about a decade worth of research. And in that time, I noticed evangelical culture changing, hence the subtitle of the project. The first place where I really began to explore how digital habitus was changing evangelical culture was in churches. And many of you might be familiar with this type of church, an evangelical megachurch. As you can see, it looks, like it would fit in a strip mall. Many of them are in strip malls, rather than, kind of the beautiful cathedral we have outside, or, the sort of cathedral you think of in Europe. They were more fit towards strip malls, and that's no accident. It has a lot to do with this guy, Saddleback Sam. Rick Warren, the pastor, he recently retired, a very influential figure in American evangelicalism, in the late 1970s moved to southern Orange County and decided he wanted to found a church. And what he decided he was going to do was going to approach it like a business would, right? Or how he perceived a business would, which was to really survey the demographic and psychographic data of the community, try and figure out what they liked, what they wanted, where they wanted to spend their time, and then build the church around that person, right? So this is Saddleback Sam. This is from Rick Warren's mega best-selling book, The Purpose-Driven Church. And he talks about evangelicals need to cater to this type of person, right? Now there's a lot of things he notices in his notes, right? He prefers the casual over the formal or the informal, right? He's high tech, as we can see, right? He has a beeper, he has a cell phone. He's well dressed, right? There's a lot of things we can see here that also are not in Rick Warren's notes, right? He's white, right? He's clearly middle class. He's a man, and all these things, of course, matter as well. This became the sort of central habitus, this habitus of Saddleback Sam, Mr. South Orange County, that the megachurch movement really catered to, right? That of the white suburbanite. And the strategy was incredibly successful. Megachurches from the late 1970s, really up until today, have grown and continue to grow. Their megachurch is typically defined by a church that houses 2,000 parishioners per weekend, but many house many more, like Lakewood Church in Texas, Joel Osteen's church. Maybe some of you are familiar with Joel Osteen, the televangelist, right? So they've become incredibly popular. And as you can see here, they look a lot more like a Costco than a cathedral. Again, no accent. And inside of the church, the strategy was the same, right? What we have to do, and Rick Warren said explicitly, we need to be competing with television, right? Saddleback Sam would rather be watching TV on a Sunday, so how do we compete with that, right? And the way that megachurches answered that question was by incorporating screens, sometimes movie-sized screens, into evangelical megachurches, right? When you walk into a megachurch, you will see a big screen. Sometimes you'll see 3 screens, sometimes 5 screens, right? You're going to see a fog machine, Christian rock, right? It's supposed to be fun, a fun experience that can compete with television and hold Saddleback Sam, the sort of suburbanite, attention, right? And this worked for a long time, but nearly every church leader that I spoke with mentioned this issue, this problem, right? The growth of what's known as the growth of the millennial nuns, right? The millennials who do not declare any religious affiliation on surveys. The mega church strategy had attracted boomers, right? Like Saddleback Sam, but it wasn't as appealing to millennials, and even less appealing, perhaps, to members of Gen Z. Of which we have many representatives here today. So evangelicals told me that to keep up with culture, to remain relevant, a term they often used, to culture, they had to go digital. Enter the startup church. Overwhelmingly, I was told that the church that did this best was a church in Edmond, Oklahoma, called Life Church. Life Church was the first church to have an online campus. It is now a network of churches all around the country. And what really set them apart, especially at the time when they started their online church in 2006, was their hyper-focus on creating a digital church and on digital habitus. And this had a lot to do with Bobby Grunwald, who leads the Digerati team at Life Church. The church, it was reported by the New York Times, that the church in 2013 alone, in 1 year, invested $20 million in the Digerati team, right? So this is a church in Edmond, Oklahoma. And with that money, they created what really is the killer app in evangelicalism, the YouVersion Bible app. It's been downloaded about 500 million times. There's a ticker on the website. It's always going up and up and up. The Bible has been translated into every language, including languages spoken by less than 1,000 people. And when you attend church at Life Church in Edmond, Oklahoma, as I did, the app is the centerpiece of the experience. Not just because people are using it, which they are. There's no Bibles in the pews in front of you that you can use. You use the app, right? But also that there are videos explaining to you how the app is redeeming the world, how it's saving the world, right? And you, a parishioner here who is tithing, who is funding this, are part of a revival, right? And I was also told that by people there, right? We are part of a revival. God is doing this through our church, right? And specifically through these digital tools that we can create. And this is what made it relevant and exciting. And to be clear, the people that I spoke with looked a lot like, not coincidentally, Saddleback Sam, right? They said this is how our church is remaining relevant and exciting. And that strategy has been, although Life Church is probably the most prominent example of this, it's just one example of how evangelicals are sort of turning towards digital habitus to try and attract more people, and also to double down on their core sort of audience of white suburbanites who find this exciting and relevant. A related space is that of the faith tech sector. So in churches, it's now very common for there to be a tithing app, for there to be multiple apps that are used across services. And those are created in and around Silicon Valley, also here in Los Angeles, Silicon Beach. And so I spoke to entrepreneurs who were creating apps for this Christian audience. Now these entrepreneurs want to make money, of course. They hope they're funding a unicorn, right? A startup that will make $1 billion, or have $1 billion valuation rather. But they also really see their work as Christianizing technology use, Christianizing digital habitus, right? As incredibly important to the world, right? And one thing that kind of stood out to me was that the way that they talked about their apps and their digital products wasn't really all that different from the way that social entrepreneurs, especially at the time, I think this might be a little less common now, but social entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley talked about their products, right? Creating something, creating an app that was not only going to make money, but was also going to solve a problem or do good in the world, right? It's kind of a common Silicon Valley discourse that was sort of remixed by a lot of evangelicals that I talked to and kind of cast in a Christian frame. There's a venture capital company that I think is really helpful for understanding this here. They're a Christian venture capital company that funds Christian apps and other businesses. And they call this understanding of the power of business and of the power of tech business in particular, redemptive entrepreneurship, right? So entrepreneurship that's going to redeem somehow. And I was told by people at Praxis that Christians working tech were like Paul, meaning the Apostle Paul, in the agora, the marketplace, where Paul sort of witnessed to others about his faith, so too were these Christians witnessing to the people around them about their faith, and through their apps also kind of bringing this faith-based understanding of technology use into the world and hopefully redeeming the world in the process. And so this idea of redemptive entrepreneurship is what's guiding those people working in the faith tech sector. And I also argue that this somewhat reveals the power that business, and especially tech business, has in the American imaginary. Now this idea of redemptive entrepreneurship plays really well in Silicon Valley, with Christians in Silicon Valley, with Christians in Silicon Beach. But what I found is, much like tech evangelism of all stripes, it doesn't necessarily translate well outside of those spaces, right? And another space that I visited in my travelogue was the missions world. And I ended up meeting a network of people involved in what's known as mobile ministry. Missions work in evangelical Christianity is, of course, linked to imperialism, to white supremacy, to racism. But there's also a lot of interesting scholarship about the way that the evangelical understanding of the world is shaped through missions work. And for example, those missionaries working in Africa in the 1960s were vocal proponents of the civil rights movement and brought back a different understanding of race from the field to evangelicals at home in the United States. So the history of missions work is problematic, it's complicated. And historically, evangelical Christian missionaries have also been invested in using and adapting media technologies to spread their messages. And I was told that now what they see are the new Roman roads emerging around them. So the Roman roads, they told me, were put down by God so that Jesus could walk on them and spread his message. And now the new Roman roads of mobile telephony are put down for Christians to use to spread the message of Jesus, right? And so this is the sort of worldview of missions work in the digital age in the mobile ministry space. But the problems that digital missionaries ran up against were myriad, right? And they found that our understanding of technology here, our digital habitus, didn't always translate into any context, right? It didn't always port naturally into the missions field. Not everyone thinks the iPhone is intuitive, right? And because of this, evangelicals in the missions field were much more invested in hacking, These were the hackers of the Christian world. Pictured here is a Code for the Kingdom hackathon. Code for the Kingdom is a Christian organization that hosts hackathons all over the world in different spots every 6 months, I think. And what they're purportedly trying to do is empower indigenous creators to hack technology so that it's useful for them in the indigenous context. And also so that they can spread the message of Jesus in a more natural way. So in doing this, they really developed some interesting critiques of the proprietary nature of consumer media technology and the consumer media technology industry. And they talked a lot about things like the free and open source software movement and other types of alternatives to like corporate held technology. So in some ways, digital missionaries are challenging some of the discourses of digital habitus that I found in the faith tech sector and in the church. And in some ways, their insistence on using digital tools still reflects the cultural imperialism and technological determinism that has been characteristic of missions work for a long time. And another thing that I think is revealed by the issues faced by digital ministry is that when filtered through different cultural lenses, digital habitus can take on a new life, a different life, right? And I think this is also the case with Christian women on Instagram. I want to argue that's the case. This is Savannah LaBrant. I don't know if anybody here is familiar with her, Savannah LaBrant and the LaBrant fam. Savannah has 7.2 million followers. Each of her kids, she now has 4. Each of her kids has their own Instagram page. They have a really popular YouTube channel. They kind of traffic in this normative vision of Christian family values and especially Christian femininity, right? Now, before I talk about evangelical influencers, I have to show you this, unfortunately. This may be a familiar image to some, I hope not, but this diagram explains what's known as complementarianism, the idea that God created men and women to have different complementary strengths, right? And when ordered in the correct way, this kind of created the perfect family structure. So the man, guided by God, provides for the family and is the boss, and the woman cares for the children and home, right? So this is the correct ordering of the domestic sphere. And it's also reflected in the public sphere of evangelicalism. In most of the denominations that comprise evangelicalism, women are not allowed to become preachers. They can't be ordained. In some, they're not allowed to hold a microphone in the church space. In some, they're not allowed to approach the pulpit, right? So that it's very controlled in terms of how women are allowed to speak and when and where they're allowed to speak and preach. The design of evangelicalism from the public to the private is such that women have a lesser sphere of influence and have less power. But social media in some ways has upended those umbrellas. This is Jen Hatmaker. She had a show on HGTV and then became popular through Facebook and then Instagram and Twitter. Now she has a super popular podcast called For the Love. She got divorced, but she was the wife of a pastor in Texas. And again, kind of trafficked in that normative Christian feminine version of, family values and all of that. But in 2016, Hatmaker came out as a never-Trumper, one of a handful of evangelical never-Trumpers, meaning they were not going to vote for Donald Trump. And that was her first sin. And then in 2017, she came out with a statement on Facebook saying that evangelicals should respect LGBTQ Christians and should affirm their marriages. And that was her second sin. And the backlash was really swift and really vitriolic. She was called in public on headlines a heretic, right? She was seen as particularly dangerous because she had this huge following, right? And her following also only grew through this, right? So she while she was condemned by a lot of really influential people in the evangelical power structure, it didn't change the fact that she was very popular. Similar story with Beth Moore, also from Texas. Like Hatmaker, she came out as an ever-Trumper in 2016. Also, like Hatmaker, she was told by many evangelicals to shut up, right? And like Hatmaker, the more she spoke up, the more followers she gained. And she also started conversations around sexual abuse in and outside of evangelicalism. And that was fuel to the Church 2 movement, which saw women across evangelical culture sharing stories of sexual abuse in evangelical culture. There was sort of a constellation of hashtags, Church 2, SBC2. And just as the Me Too movement shed light on some of these hideous open secrets in Hollywood, the Church 2 movement did the same for evangelicalism. Bill Hybels, a popular megachurch pastor, resigned his position after allegations of sexual misconduct became public, allegations that were purportedly known for 10 years or more. Paige Patterson, a leader in the Southern Baptist Convention, the largest evangelical organization in the United States, was also forced to resign. So this sort of, the ability for women to speak on social media and create their own sort of congregations has really created a sea change and a threat to the evangelical hierarchical power structure. And women are preaching and teaching outside of the church, right? Even when they're using those sort of visual norms of normative Christian womanhood, right? Even when they're using that, what they're saying is not always reflective of what the evangelical power structure wants to hear, right? And so often they have gone against the sort of conservative norms of evangelical culture. And I argue that a similar shift has happened and is happening with the evangelical understanding of race. And to investigate this phenomenon, I spent time with Black Christian podcasters in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd. Anthea Butler has argued that the evangelical understanding of race can be characterized by evangelical gentility, right? A sort of niceness that is ultimately sort of phony, right? A feeling that, evangelicals are happy to make gestures, white evangelicals are happy to make gestures towards racial reconciliation, but will not concede that there's any sort of structural problems or systemic problems that need to be addressed. As Rick Warren put it in a popular tweet, racism is a sin problem, not a skin problem, right? So it's a sin. It's bad to be racist, but it's not necessarily indicative of anything else, right? But that's not really how Black Christians have understood the situation, right? And what's interesting here is that popular Black Christian podcasts, such as Truth Table or Pass the Mic, have really been able to sort of reframe the conversation around race and evangelical culture on their own terms. Perhaps for the first time, because white evangelicals really control a lot of the power structures in evangelicalism, although evangelicalism is not a monolith. It's not a racial monolith. Bible colleges, Christian schools, not-for-profits are typically controlled by the white evangelical power structure. In having and amplifying these conversations, Black Christians really are reorienting the evangelical understanding of race. And white evangelicals, there has been also backlashes to this, as with Jen Hatmaker and Beth Moore. But it really can't be turned off, right? So in conclusion, digital habitus is changing, digital life is changing evangelical culture. While those in positions of leadership push to integrate digital habitus into the church space as a means to keep up with changes in popular culture, and evangelicals in tech see the opportunity to redeem the world through digital products, those using technology might understand it differently. Women and Black Christians in particular have used the technology to challenge the established power structures in evangelical culture. And I just want to end saying, I looked at evangelical culture and over 10 years, and I did see it change. But I don't think that's the only place that culture is changing as a result of the digital. I hope I don't sound too technologically determinist there, but you're welcome to challenge that in the Q&A. Thank you so much.
So we've prepared a few questions for me to ask Corrina, so I hope that you'll all be interested in some of these questions as we were. So through much of the book, we see individuals looking at digital life through the lens of redemption, either in themselves or others. What other ways might evangelicals view these tools?
I definitely think there's a spectrum. I saw people talk about digital tools, and I talked to people who really spoke about digital tools as a God-given. Actually, the initial title for this was What God Gave to Us, because I did see a social media consultant say, we'll be judged in heaven by how well we use what God gave to us. And he was talking about social media, right? So we will be judged in heaven for how well we use this. When we're talking about evangelicals, the spectrum is, if God gave it to you, on the other side of the spectrum is that it can also be a tool of the devil. I have also seen that as well. I'm currently working on a project about Christian TikTok. And one thing I really see on TikTok is people talking about how, the enemy doesn't want you to see this, right? There's this sort of spiritual warfare going on with the way that evangelicals on TikTok are trying to game the algorithm. So there's different ways to see this within a spiritual frame. Of course, there's also people in evangelicalism who are just, have concerns about technology as well, but I mostly did not come across that.
Cool. So even before Elon Musk showed up, tech pundits have been predicting the fall of the big social media giants like Twitter and Facebook as people move toward more niche communities. Were you seeing this move in your research as well, or is the emphasis still on populating the big networks?
I really appreciate this question, and I think this is a great question. Yes, I think this is true. I don't want to give Elon Musk too much credit, but I think this is happening, that there is a move from places, and it's not just happening in evangelicalism, but a move from places like Instagram and Twitter towards places like Gab and Parler and closed, more siloed spaces in the digital sphere. And this is actually what my sort of second book project is going to be focused on. It's, I think, dangerous, right? Because we see evangelicals sort of in these filter bubbles where their beliefs are being reinforced and fueled by people who believe only similar things, which can lead to radicalization, political polarization, and I think that is happening with especially white Christian nationalist discourses that are unfortunately gaining a lot of steam right now.
Yeah, it's a little scary out there. How do the participants in your study react differently in small niches, in small niche online communities versus the large platforms?
I don't know if I know the answer to that yet. Yeah, I think that's all I can say.
Okay.
Well, I don't want to go too far on a limb.
So in this book you talk about your ethnographic research, and to paraphrase in the book, you note that a researcher can no longer be simply an observer, but rather is also observed by his informants. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about these effects when you're doing research? It was something I had not thought about. Mm-hmm. It was very interesting to me.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting. It's not quite an original thought. My advisor, John Jackson, is an ethnographer who trained me. He worked with the Black Hebrew Israelites, wrote a great book called Indescription. I encourage everyone to check it out. But he talked about this and sort of part of my training as an ethnographer as well. And his solution to it is what I think is a really good one, which is ethnographic sincerity, right? So, your informants, if we want to call the people that you're studying that, can see what you're doing and can
know a lot about your political beliefs, your family, everything, because it's all out there, right? They can contact you at midnight, right, if they want to. That never happened to me, but I think it definitely could, right? To sort of account for that, John talks about this idea of ethnographic sincerity. We have to approach everything more honestly, perhaps, right? This is a good thing in a way. It's also just a good life hack, right? Approaching things with more honesty and more authenticity is really the only way to sort of solve that problem in the digital age. Whereas we could, even if the ethnographers weren't using deception, we're always using some sort of mask, right? And that mask is somewhat lifted.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. So one of the biggest issues in the book is how the evangelicals are narrowly focused on white Western Christians. Do you see a way for technology to win over the large section of the world that is not a part of that segment?
I think, this is also partially a bias of that I did this work, field work in the United States, right? I'm sure there are things going on in other places, and as many evangelicals have noted, themselves, that evangelicalism is growing globally more than it is growing in the United States. Wow. I think that if that is to happen, it will probably come from outside of the United States, from Christians working in other places.
Where are they working the most? Do you know? What area is it?
Africa, South America.
Yeah. Okay.
Is where I think the growth is in evangelicalism is happening the most.
Yeah.
It's very general, 2 continents, but I'm sure there's more granular data on that.
I was just thinking about that. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I just kind of went off a little. The use of technology, especially podcasting, seems to be a double-edged sword for the evangelical church, and I think you actually mentioned this, in that the same flexibility and freedom that technology offers and is being used to engage and recruit a large swath of the population has also given many a platform to attack and maybe pull away from the church. Do you think that that's a danger, truly a danger? That
I'm not an evangelical, nor am I a normative researcher, so I wouldn't call it a danger. I think, evangelicalism is changing, and I think that it's a danger to those people in power that are ignoring it, in that, to be brittle in this moment is possibly to fail, right? And I think that's maybe true of a lot of industries and sort of across. Maybe we could even think about that in terms of education and higher ed as well. So things are changing, and having to sort of adapt to that is just part of our moment.
And you talk in the book that the evangelicals are more white, more older generation. That is the technology really bringing in the new younger?
I don't think so. I don't. I certainly did not see any evidence to that. And I was a guest on a Christian podcast, and we're like, well, how do we do that, right? And so I think that they want to get to that point, but I have not actually seen that happening.
Yeah, interesting. You talked about the Black podcasters, and in the book it says that they give marginalized people within the church the opportunity to have a voice, but also the opportunity to craft a new narrative. Can you talk about this new narrative and why it is so important?
Yeah, one thing I didn't have a chance to get into because of time here was in the 1990s there was a really big movement called the Promise Keepers, an evangelical men's movement. And the Promise Keepers really tried to craft a narrative of racial reconciliation within their movement, and they would do things like have a white Christian come up and wash the feet of a Black Christian, right? And just, tears and, sort of emotional performances to try and semiotically signal this idea of racial reconciliation. And Tyler Burns, one of the podcasters that I spoke with on one of his podcasts, he said, why are you crying? Write a check, right? And I think that's really interesting. I mean, they're talking about reparations, literal financial reparations in these podcasts, from churches to the communities surrounding them, right? And this is a narrative that was certainly not crafted by white Christians as the narrative in the racial reconciliation movement was, right? And again, the racial reconciliation movement really focused on individual sort of, relationships between people. And not only did they say, well, white people need to repent of their sin, black people need to repent of their, sort of anger over that, right? Well, we all got to get over it, right? It's like, was not crafted by, sort of crafted in this very somewhat convenient framework. And so the black podcasters are sort of reframing that and saying that really wasn't useful for us.
Yeah. Oh gosh. So in doing your years of interviews and research, what surprised you the most?
I think, actually going to the startup church in Edmond, Oklahoma, it really looks like a mid-sized tech startup. I went on a tour there and I passed by a room. What are they doing there? Oh, well, those are our futurists, right? Two guys sitting in a room. They're evangelical futurists talking about, well, what's the next thing in technology? What are we going to do, right? They had coders and their hoodies, and it just like was set up exactly like a tech startup. And that really surprised me and was really interesting. Just, especially, it was just right off of freeway in Edmond, Oklahoma. It was not the place where you would expect, or where I expected it and to find that. Except for I did go looking for it, so I guess I did expect it. I was impressed knowing that it was there. Yeah.
So are there any technological ideas, any cool apps, any amazing devices that just knocked your socks off in your research?
There's interesting things. I think some of the hacking that's being done in the missions field is interesting. I learned things talking to these people. I've had someone, these kids.
Everybody's a critic.
So rude that someone would bring their children to this for example, this, it's actually here in Torrance, somebody who created what he called pastor boxes, which are little like Raspberry Pis, for those of you who know what that is, that can be dropped from planes into, and had on them like seminary level training for indigenous pastors.
Wow.
So they're really, interesting stuff that I would never have thought to do something like that. So,
this whole book, I urge you to read this book because it was really fascinating. And I'm just a nice Jewish girl. I don't know much about evangelicals, but it was just really eye-opening and very well written, even for laymen. So it was just really a really good book, and you can take a look at it right here. So we would like to take questions from any of you who might want to ask Corrina a question.
Okay, should I stand up again?
No. Oh, you can do whatever you want.
Well, maybe I'll stand up.
Okay, everyone. So do we have any questions? Who's going to be the first person? Oh, come on, guys.
Okay, so I'm going to ask
There we
this
go.
question. First of all, I'm going to say, no, I'm good. Actually, I think your presentation was brilliant, so congratulations, and I do this again. So this is going to be kind of silly, but help me understand why I feel there's an oxymoron in the construct of Christian hackers.
Well, I don't know. I think, I don't know, maybe because we think of hackers as typically being countercultural, and we think of Christians as being very mainstream and sort of milquetoast. And in general, that's true. But I'm just kidding. I don't mean to be rude. But they're there, and they're. I think Well, one thing that was really interesting to me initially when I started doing this research was the way that a lot of these sort of popular cultural constructions, like that of the hacker or that of the tech startup starting in the garage, could be remixed and reframed into a Christian context, could be kind of Christianized by these people. And to me, that was the really initial thing that made me really start thinking about the power of these discourses and their sort of hold on popular imagination.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. I mean, and that's exactly what I'm thinking. I just needed to hear somebody else teasing it out. Because there's also the subtext that says, by any means necessary.
Very
Right,
true.
right.
Yes.
So it's Christianity and the proselytizing, right, by any means necessary. Hence, hacking becomes that strategic tool, right, as a counter mechanism to sort of get at it or get it out, whatever that might be.
Very, very true, and I'm really glad you put it that way, because one of the things that I saw with these in the mobile ministry field is people would always tell me, somebody saw our app in Saudi Arabia, right? Somebody saw our app in Saudi Arabia. And it was this thing of like, if we can cloak a Bible app so it looks like something else,
Nice.
we can get into places where Christians can't go, right? So it is this by any means necessary, we can do this work in the digital realm that we can't do in person in Saudi Arabia. For those of you that might know that proselytization is illegal, right? So absolutely. Yeah.
Nice. Thank you.
Anybody else have a question? Yes, sir.
In your time working with all the evangelicals that you worked with, do you feel you've developed, I don't know, a more sincere understanding or appreciation or of understanding, where they're coming from, like as a whole?
Yes, absolutely. And I think I have met people that really upended stereotypes of all kinds, right? And really surprised me, and I have had great conversations that were my informants. So absolutely. And I think it is important also to talk to people that aren't exactly like us and to, again, approach it always with ethnographic sincerity.
Good question. Yeah.
So what is the Sunday morning experience at Life Church? Where you're going to a satellite facility and watching a pastor on a screen, who provides the actual ministering to the congregation that's right there in person?
Great question. I did all three. I went to the church with the lead pastor in person. I went to the satellite churches with the pastor on the screen. And those churches, they have another sort of junior pastor who's there, right? As the person of record. And then I also went to the online church where everything's on the screen and there is an online pastor who's there, right? As the person on record in the online chat. So there's a kind of accounting for that. I think it's difficult if you, for example, want to get married or something like that, right? And you're an online parishioner. How do you have a pastor who can, officiate your wedding or things like that? It comes up against a lot of issues, including baptism. How do you baptize people online? Is the laptop going to get wet? I mean, these are conversations I had these conversations with people, and this is really what people in this field do really talk about. And it's a problem that is hard to address. And I think, maybe the biggest problem is that of community. It is not impossible, of course, to have online communities, but they're always different. I think of the sort of covered dishes people bring you when you're sick or hurt or something, right? I guess you can order DoorDash for someone. So there's always a technological solution somewhere, maybe.
I have a question. So do they do tithing on Venmo or something?
There's an app called Tidely. I actually spoke to the guy, Dean Sweetman, who created this app. He was a former pastor, so Tidely is used. There are actually a few different tithing apps.
Wow.
But that's actually much more common now than the cash in churches. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. Tithing's around.
Do we have any more questions? Yes,
I'll ask
John,
a question.
go for it.
So I also want to second reading Dr. Laughlin's book. It is absolutely amazing. And personally, I grew up
Thanks, John.
evangelical, and so there was a lot in there. I was like, oh my goodness, wow. I forgot about those things, especially this idea of being of, but not with the world, or being with but not of the world. And I know that the other side of that sword is this sort of resistance or antagonism or fear of the outside world. So my question is about your methodology and how did you approach your participants, your subjects, and how did you develop that trust with them, knowing that they knew that you were going into this with a somewhat outside perspective?
I think for most of my experiences, people were maybe more open than I had expected, and a lot of that was because, talking to people who run, faith-based startups, they really want to get the word out there no matter what, right? They don't really care who they're talking to, and they'll if you're going to sort of help them, tell other people about what they're doing, they were happy to talk. Also in the church space, I found people incredibly welcoming. So I ended up having a lot of really honest and sincere conversations with people without trying too hard. I don't know. And I also didn't get a lot of no's. Yeah. I think typically, and because I've done interviews for other projects and done some ethnographic work, typically people are very flattered, right? To be asked that, talk to me about your life and your worldview. I found people to be very open.
That's awesome. Any other questions from any of you honor students? Yeah? Okay, well then I think we should start to close. Let me just put my act together. And we can see what's left of the food and drink. And we can all stand in line and shake Corrina's hand because Michelle told us we could.